Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Community Arts Partnership, for this amazing festival. I'm really grateful to see all of you on a beautiful day when we could have been outside. We're introducing ourselves, and I will say I am a poet. I'm the editor of Ghost Fishing, and we're here to celebrate the release of that book, which just happened on April 19th. So this is the first reading in Ithaca. And I'm here with Mukoma Ngugi, who is my writing friend, and he is a literature professor of African literature at Cornell. He's the author of books of fiction, books of poetry, and most recently, The Rise of the African Novel, Politics of Language, Identity, and Citizenship. And also the fiction novel Nairobi Heat, which is a lot of fun if you haven't checked it out. But he's also a great poet, and he is in this anthology, the Eco-Justice Poetry Anthology. I'll say a little bit about myself and how I came into the book as introduction to the book, which is I have a background in environmental activism, and I worked for about 7 years for an organization that was fighting for safe disposal of chemical weapons. And as part of that work, learned and visited a lot of communities around environmental justice issues and saw daily the impact of war on the environment, and that intersection of social justice and the environment was planted pretty deeply in my consciousness. As a poet, after doing activist work in my 20s, I went to grad school to study poetry and to learn how to be a poet. And I struggled with trying to figure out, how do I write about those experiences in poetry, and who is writing this kind of poetry, and what does it look like, and how do we deal with the complexities of race and class and dispossession of people from the land that is happening so widely in this country and in the world. And picking up nature anthologies, that's not necessarily the pictures, the poems that you get. And for those of you that read them, they're mostly, we're coming from a tradition of white, European-centered nature poetry, which is often, separation of the self from nature. The wilderness is a place we go to outside of our cities, outside of ourselves. It's not part of our community. It's a place where we rest and recreate, and nature poetry still holds that tradition, even though there are a gazillion ways that poets are challenging and working against that. And so this anthology looks at the connection between social justice, the environment, and culture. The book, it's organized by theme at the intersections where these topics connect. So topics like dispossession and attachment to the land, war, resources, environmental disaster, and also the ways that we build resilience around these disasters and survival and such. So we'll read from different sections, a few, and then I want to open this up for conversation. And I'm particularly interested in your thoughts about, how do we get these poems and these poets into the community, into our conversations and into the work that we're doing around sustainability and social justice and food justice and so on. We'll start with a poem. The first poem in the book is by Ross Gay. He's an African-American poet. This poem, we published it at Split This Rock, which is an organization that celebrates poetry of provocation and witness. And it went immediately viral online. And a lot of poems online do that, but I have never seen a poem travel so quickly as this poem. The poem references Eric Garner. And as you remember, Eric Garner was selling Lucy's in New York City on the sidewalk, and the police approached him and arrested him and held him down, and he couldn't breathe. And there was a crowd gathered, and he was yelling, "I can't breathe," and he died on the sidewalk. And we saw a lot of news footage after that. Right. And Ross Gay responds to that incident with this poem. A small, needful fact is that Eric Garner worked for some time for the Parks and Recreational Horticultural Department, which means, perhaps, that with his very large hands, perhaps, in all likelihood, he put gently into the earth some plants which, most likely, some of them, in all likelihood, continue to grow, continue to do what such plants do, like house and feed small and necessary creatures, like being pleasant to touch and smell, like converting sunlight into food, like making it easier for us to breathe. And I love the way that poem keeps Eric Garner alive for us, but also shows us a part of him that we don't get from the news that we consume. I'm going to hand it over to Mukoma to read a couple poems. So welcome, Mukoma.
Thank you, and let me second Melissa by saying, thank you for coming out on well, it's a bit muggy outside, but still, you could have been outside instead of being in here. And also to thank Melissa for including me in this anthology. And I think it speaks to her character as a poet, to have spent actually a number of years immersed in other people's poetry, right? Most of us would be like, well, it's not my poetry, I'm not working on it. And I think also it speaks to your conviction around issues of eco-justice. It's a beautiful anthology, right? And part of what I'm enjoying about it is really immersing myself well in other people's poetry and finding my favorite poems. So the ones I picked are the ones that are speaking to me now for either reasons of language or sound or content. So let me read you two, and then I'll hand over to Melissa, then we'll do back and forth for a while. And the first poem I want to read is by Joseph Kamunyoka called You and I Are Disappearing. The cry I bring down from the hills belongs to a girl still burning inside my head. At daybreak, she burns like a piece of paper. She burns like foxfire in a thigh-shaped valley. A skirt of flames dances around her at dusk. We stand with our hands hanging at our sides while she burns like a sack of dry ice. She burns like oil on water. She burns like a cattail torch dipped in gasoline. She glows like the fat tip of a banker's cigar, silent as quicksilver. A tiger under a rainbow at nightfall. She burns like a shot glass of vodka. She burns like a field of poppies at the edge of a rainforest. She rises like dragon smoke to my nostrils. She burns like a burning bush given by a god-awful wind. Let me read you a poem by June Jordan called Focus in Real Time. A bowl of rice as food, as politics or metaphor, as something valuable and good, or something common to consume, exploit, ignore. Who grew these grains? Who owned the land? Who harvested the crop? Who converted these soft particles to money? Who kept the cash? Who shipped the consequence of the cash? Who else was going to eat the rice? Who else was going to convert the rice to cash? Who would design the flowers for the outside of the bowl? Who would hold the bowl between her hands? Who would give the bowl away? Who could share the rice? Who could fill that bowl with rice how many times a day, how many times a week? Who would adore the hands that held the bowl, that held the rice? Who would adore the look, the smell, the steam of boiled rice in a bowl? Who will analyze the cash? Who will analyze the cash the rice becomes? Who will sit beside the bowl Who will sit beside the bowl or fight for rice? Who will write about the hands that hold the bowl? Who will want to own the hand? Who will want to own the land? A bowl of rice. And I should switch to.
And we're going to try to go back and forth between hope and despair as we go. There is a lot of despair in this book, and I think that part of the value of a very culturally diverse collection of poems or Vinnie's stories is that we learn about survival from those who have been surviving for so long. And many of these poems, though they are filled with despair, they also have these twists of hope. These poems are part of the resistance and of hanging on to culture. That's really important in all cultures. The next poem I want to read is by Elise Patchen. She's an Osage writer. And the name of this poem is Wa Chi'i, and that is Osage for prayer. And it's dedicated to Anna Kyle Brown, Osage, who lived from 1896 to 1921 in Fairfax, Oklahoma. Because she died where the ravine falls into the water, because they dragged her down to the creek. In death, she wore her blue broadcloth skirt. Though frost blanketed the grass, she cooled her feet in the spring. Because I was the log with my foot, her slippers floated downstream into the dam. Because after the thaw, the hunters discovered her body. Because she lived without our mother. Because she inherited head rights for oil beneath the land. She was carrying his offspring. The sheriff disguised her death as whiskey poisoning. Because when he carved her body up, he saw the bullet hole in her skull. Because when she was murdered, the leg clutchers bloomed, but then froze under the weight of frost. During Thachak Zagazi, the killer of the flower's moon, I will wade across the river of the blackfish, the otter, the beaver. I will climb the bank where the willow never dies. I'm reminded to be aware of Indigenous women that are missing and unaccounted for all over this country. And this is Joy Harjo, and some of you may already know the poem. Perhaps the world ends here. The world begins at the kitchen table. No matter what, we must eat to survive, to live. The gifts of earth are brought and prepared, set on the table. So it has been since creation, and it will go on. We chase chickens or dogs away from it. Babies teethe at the corners. They scrape their knees under it. It is here that children are given instructions on what it means to be human. We make men at it. We make women. At this table we gossip, recall enemies, and the ghosts of lovers. Our dreams drink coffee with us as they put their arms around our children. They laugh with us at our poor falling down selves, and as we put ourselves back together once again at the table. This table has been housed in the rain, an umbrella in the sun. Wars have begun and ended at this table. It is a place to hide in the shadow of terror, a place to celebrate the terrible victory. We have given birth at this table and have prepared our parents for burial here. At this table, we sing with joy and sorrow. We pray of suffering and remorse. We give thanks. Perhaps the world will end at the kitchen table while we are laughing and crying, eating the last sweet bite.
Let me read you a poem by Martin Espada. I love the poem because it does invite us to think about who grows the food, the relationship between food and corporations, and for me in particular, coming from Kenya and Africa in general, where the issue is about GMOs, right? It's about, on the one side, people who are fighting for food sovereignty, right? And on the other hand, people who are trying to introduce genetically modified organisms through, do-gooders actually, do-gooders like Bill Gates, right? The Bill Gates Foundation, has it's called the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, AGRA, right? And the whole idea behind that, as food activists argue, is to sneak in, it's almost like a Trojan horse for genetically modified organisms. And I don't know, yeah, so what I find interesting about this whole debate is how, we try to throw science, right? We try to throw science at problems that actually are quite easy to fix. But in trying to throw science, we end up destroying, diversity, that has evolved to be what it is, by trying to think of supersedes. But this particular poem, I think, is more about food, labor in the United States, which is more relevant now, with Trump. Frederico's Ghost. The story is that whole families of fruit pickers still crept between the furrows of the field at dusk, when for reasons of whiskey or whatever, the crop duster plane sprayed anyway, floating a pesticide drizzle over the pickers, who thrashed like dark birds in a glistening white net, except for Frederico, a skinny boy who stood apart in his green row, and knowing the pilot would not understand in Spanish that he was the son of a whore, he instead jacked his arm and thrust an obscene finger. The pilot understood. He circled the plane and sprayed again, watching a fine gauze of poison drift over the brown bodies that cowered and scurried on the ground, and aiming for Frederico, leaving the skin beneath his shirt wet and blistered, but still pumping his finger at the sky. After Frederico died, rumors at the labor camp told of tomatoes picked and smashed at night, growers muttering of vandal children, or communists in camp, first threatening to call immigration, then promising every Sunday off if only the smashing of tomatoes could stop. Still, tomatoes were picked and squashed in the dark, and the old women in camp said it was Frederico, laboring after sundown to cool the burns on his arms, flinging tomatoes at the crop duster that hummed like a mosquito, lost in his ear and kept his soul awake. Cutting Greens by Lucille Clifton. Curling them around, I hold their bodies in obscene embrace, thinking of everything but kinship. Collars and kale strain against each stranger, other away from my kiss-making hand and the iron bedpot. The pot is black, the cutting board is black, my hand, and just for a minute, the greens roll black under the knife, and the kitchen twists dark on its spine, and I taste in my natural appetite the bond of live things everywhere. Yep.
Okay. And I'll read The Bee People, Amy Miller. The bee people sat quiet while the council droned about the ugly new plaza and knots of traffic. They sat in their sandals and blue t-shirts painted with the tiger backs of bees and waited for the votes about hives and lots and setbacks and neighbor notification and EpiPens and the relative aggression of wasps and the range of the average working bee and colony collapse and fields east of the rain shadow. Some hummed. One trembled. I noticed their hair, a golden sheen on every head as if bees had somehow had a hand in getting them there, had pushed them down the walk with wings that hovered magic and precise like small hands steering them by the sun to where they had to go. The bee people. And this is a poem from Rupi Sanabria, and this poem is Hiking with My Father. On the lookout for bears, cougars, hypothermia, starvation, poisonous bugs, trees falling, landslides, avalanches, poisonous berries, snakes, frostbite, cuts, sprains, dehydration, and Confederate flags. Through Snoqualmie Falls, the Olympic Mountains, and finally Mount St. Helens, we now witness patches of minuscule purple petals, blooming so soon after the blasts, blooming from the sterile dusts, blooming from the forest of the standing dead. We lean forward into railings toward the burnt saint and her new fringe of purple lupine. Notice Dad, the saint's scars and her new patterns of moving water, of receiving water, of sharing water. This is how to adapt to lack of air, to loss of earth, to a cooler sun. Where is the well of courage, or is it madness to rise again at the rim of violence?
Let me read you one of my poems called Kenya, a Love Letter. It's a poem I wrote in 2007. Because shortly after the elections of late 2006, there was electoral violence broke out in Kenya, which is as a result of landlessness, right? We kept the same, we kept the same economic system, a very unequal and oppressive one that we inherited from colonialism, right? And part of the irony of that sort of civil strife is that it's the poor who end up killing each other, right, and doing the dying, while the rich, while the elite, they keep working on accumulating more wealth. So just to give you one statistic, so in a country where people were killing each other for land, the sitting president, Uhuru Kenyatta, his family owns 565,000 acres of land, right? There was a time recently within the last election when the opposition and the sitting party where the leaders are so rich, right, that they declared sanctions against each other, right, So the president told his followers not to buy, not to buy natural gas from the opposition, and the opposition told his supporters not to buy milk, from the sitting president. So the poem is called Kenya, a Love Letter. Inside looking out, snow is falling, and I'm thinking how happy we once were when promises and dreams came easy, and how, when we lovers covered only by a warm Eldoret night, you waved a prophecy at a shooting star and said, when the time comes, we shall name our first child Kenya. And how I laughed and said, yes, our child then shall be country and human. And we held hands, roughed and toughened by shelling castor seeds. My dear, when did our clasped hands become heavy chains and anchors holding us to mines and diamond and oil fields? Our hands colored by love and play, these same hands, when did they learn to grip a machete or a gun to spit hate? And this earth that drinks our blood like a hungry child, this earth that we have scorched to cinders, when we're done eating it, how much of it will be left for Kenya? Yeah, let me read you one poem because it's related by a Kenyan poet or a Kenyan British poet by the name of Stephen Darwin Partington, called Satao. And this one is set, it's about poaching, and he wrote it in 2014. Cowards, let us sing in Dead El Molo how the elephants have died. We thank the cavemen that they drew them. The zoologists described them for the photos of them herding, which the tourists left behind. For who would ever, fools, believe us? Teeth from heaven to the ground. I stretch my arm out like a trunk to palm the graveyard of its cranium. It's how I hear they mourned. The brain within worked tools and language. I have none, a useless pen. And even then, no words. We once had taskers, tell the birds. And let me read you one final poem from, this is my latest collection of poetry, Logotherapy. It came out, I think, a year or 2 years ago. So part of my thinking is that for us who are progressive and anti-Trump, also have to go back and question our support for Obama, quite frankly, right? Part of, some of the things that Trump is doing are continuation of, of things that intensified under Obama, for example, deportations to an extent when he was called, deporter-in-chief. Or the use of drone warfare, which is the poem is about. This poem is about drone warfare. But we should ask how many innocent people did Obama kill? The clouds above. Hunting for wet clay in the marshlands of Limuru, my sister and I would spot a plane, pause, clap, laugh, and yell America to stamp our hopes on the passing dream. But for children in Pakistan and Somalia, the open sky is no longer the place to send dreams to catch a flight abroad. The sky is camouflage predator drones that track and hunt their dreams. Imagine that. A sky that is no longer a promise, and clouds that can bring down rain or death. Thank you.
Two poems of my own. And the first one is Ghost Fishing Louisiana. And that poem I wrote in response to a tour of Louisiana years ago when I was an activist through the oil, petrochemical industry communities that are just devastated, and mostly African American who are stuck in these communities living along the fence line. They can't move. Their houses are worth nothing. They don't have jobs at these plants. The plants aren't being held accountable. And it's really unbelievable when you don't grow up in a place like that to see it. And this is my attempted response. Ghost Fishing Louisiana. There's an epigraph from Reverend Willie T. Sneed, Senior, Mossville, Louisiana. These people are in prison and there's poison loose. That's not an ambulance, that's the sun going down in your rear view mirror. It gets in your clothes, it gets in the way you talk. And the thunder late at night, railroad cars full of poison bumping into one another. Gambling boats ghost fishing on Lake Charles. Sugar is refined here for sweet tea, flour bleached white. Men selling melons the size of heads. Her house held the cancer like fish in a locked box. And the other poem of mine I'll read that's in here is Monsanto, Drunk in the Garden. She whispers to plant life, come up, my sleeping herds of thistle, my stinging and resolute theocracies, my unbound glory, my sunning stars, my stranglehold of monopoly. Come up and waddle through the dirt with me, drink deep this chlorinated song, sprung lonely from a nozzle of pure joy, where I find myself most mornings weeping. Be brave, my little florets. Make haste to catch the light before it's gone. Open your petals to science. Surface the hidden world. Break blues and purples and reds in a riot of contradiction. My parrots, my garden of lambs, my pig parts, my onions. Come stir on a light breeze as bees fall to sleep in the crimson afterlife. We will be wealthy and famous forever. So now I want to open the floor for questions, comments, ideas.
What is your intention?
What is my intention with the book? My intention is to look at very complicated issues and to try to, I can't say understand them, but to learn how to put into language the intersection of these crises. How can we see social justice as being central to our environmental work and not but climate change is it's a crisis, we have to plant trees, yes. But how do we see how interconnected all of our, and do we see it? Maybe we do. But even if we do see it, we're still navigating these complex conversations around race and class and identity and economics and have and have not and dangerous times. So I believe that poetry can be a tool in helping us find language when we are just in shock by how horrible it is.
It seems to me also that poetry is already dealing with the connection between politics and the environment. Maybe poetry is the way to make those to help people to see the connection that poets already see, have been for quite a while.
Right. I want to say I hope this is a tool, this book. It's almost 500 pages of poetry, and it includes some of the forebearers. And yeah, and this is a really important point in thinking about this kind of poetry, is that I didn't invent this. These poets have been writing this in all cultures all along. It's just they haven't been recognized in the mainstream or in the center. Yeah.
Do you know which is the oldest poem in that?
Off the top of my head, I think it is Wilfred Owen in the war section. But yeah, there are poems before that, and I chose to really focus on contemporary poets mainly because I wanted a book that could be read from all over the place and that the poets could, to celebrate the work that's being done in our communities. But I started each section with forebearer to root us.
In my research and study of ecological crisis, and also in Africa, particularly in Africa, I'm struck by two contradictions that I see. One is a certain similarity in the history of how indigenous peoples have been displaced, like in the Americas and North America, and when they are in fact, their culture and tradition could contribute a great deal to healing the planet. I'm thinking particularly of the Ngugi people in Western Kenya, who are inhabitants of the Mau Forest, and went a long way towards maintaining that forest, but who were displaced through Kenyan policies, giving away a lot of that land to Kenyan bureaucrats, and is causing the decimation of that forest. And it's very critical to the climate there. And I see, and this saddens me because obviously there is it's leading to the despoliation of Kenya as well, the natural environment. That's one contradiction. The other is how generally through Africa, including Kenya, Nigeria, resources are being appropriated by Western powers to build renewable energy systems in the West as part of the sustainability paradigm. But the people of Africa are not benefiting from this. I wondered if you would speak to that.
You have touched on very fundamental contradictions within Kenyan and African and actually also global politics, where on the one hand you have a small minority, it could be ethnically driven or they could be using nationalism or whatever, right? That where their main goal is, the goal of capitalism, which is, maximum profit, even when it becomes self-destructive. I mean, now we're talking about essentially, the world changing because of climate change, to a point where we might not sustain human life, right, In Kenya, the best way of understanding just how corrupt and profit-driven the system is, what Kenya and other African countries have been doing is land leasing, right? So not only are they driving, people from their homes and so on and so forth, but then also they are leasing land to Western powers and also Middle Eastern powers to come and farm that land and take the produce back, right? So if you can imagine the idiocy of that, right? In terms of, instead of our Kenyan farmers growing their own food, right, and then exporting and so on and so forth. Now we're telling exploiters, come directly to the land, and we'll lease it for you very cheaply and so on and so forth. So there is that. There is the fact that the economy itself, as inherited from colonialism, hasn't changed. Right? There is what people call flag independence, meaning that we only changed the flag, but the system itself remained. To give you another example of how ridiculous it gets, there's almost a trade war, happening between the U.S. and some East African countries, because they're saying, look, stop dumping your second-hand clothes in our markets because you're depressing our local textile industry, right? But the local politicians and also the U.S. are so, I don't even know what to call it, because it's so ridiculous. They're so used to having the run of the place, right? That now they can argue that second-hand clothes are good for the African market. You could look at, if you're interested in following on this, you could look at the African Growth Opportunity Act, right? That was started by Clinton, where essentially it was like a NAFTA. It was like a NAFTA for some African countries, meaning that it just opened up the African markets, and also allowed Western companies to come in and remain unsupervised, right? With no labor law, there's no oversight. And the whole idea, of course, is that they will generate jobs. But what the companies would do, and not pay taxes for 5 years, but then what the companies would do is to change their names, when the 5 years are up. Then you can think about the wars that are going on. You can think about the war on terror and how it's affecting, national politics and so on and so forth. But if you really want to see something that ties all political questions together, it's actually across indigenous peoples all over the world, is the question of language and culture, right? There's an organization called the Phelps-Stokes Foundation.
Say that again.
Phelps-Stokes Foundation.
Phelps-Stokes?
Yeah, that was responsible for designing the educational system for Native Americans, African Americans, and Africans, right? And part of it, so we can go on and on and on. But in terms of the positive things, though, you can look at it the other way around, where then you have international solidarities, let's say between Africans and African Americans, at an ideological and political level, right? Black power becomes black consciousness in South Africa. Black Lives Matter, and the roads must fall, fees must fall. So there is resistance, right? It's a question of when you're being bombarded from so many sides, whether resistance as we understand it will be enough, right? Or whether we can be intersectional enough. Yeah.
Thank you. I want to thank everybody again for coming, and I also want to thank the bookstore. Wonderful bookstore.